On the 5th day of Drizztmas, that dark elf gave to me lots of daddy issues. Cheers. Ho, 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 and welcome back to Drizztmas, the 5th day of Drizztmas. And if you were wondering, yeah, I won't be doing the full song anymore because it's getting too long and I'm running out of ideas. Well, or at least I can't remember what I said yesterday, so I'm trying to do this in a shorter way. Anyway, today we'll be talking about the 5th Drizzt book in publication order, that is Exile, part 2 of the Dark Elf trilogy. Slightly better than the first one, I guess, and still boring and a lot of other issues in here, and we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a synopsis and then, or a plot summary, then we'll talk a bit about the structure, and then we'll talk about all the other stuff that is in here, how it stacks up as how it works out as a Dungeons & Dragons tie-in product, as a Forgotten Realms tie-in product, and so forth. And with that out of the way, let's do some morning drinking and talk about it, shall we? All right, so book 2 covers Drizzt's time outside of Menzoberranzan. Remember, the last time round, he left the family after they sacrificed his father and weapons master Zagnapane, and he just runs off into the nowhere with his newfound ally, Guinevere the cat. The panther, the magical one. So in this book, we have basically two plot lines. Plotline 1 is Drizzt running around in the Underdark, making friends, going on quests and so forth, and leaving finally at the end towards the surface. Because, you know, we kind of know where he has to end up, right? Part 2, or the second plot line, is what happens with his family, that being House Do'Urden, back in Menzoberranzan. That means there's conflict between his family's house and another family's house, and then his family tries to capture and sacrifice Drizzt because the Spider Queen herself is angry. She's really pissed off with Drizzt and wants Drizzt dead. Yes, our good buddy Drizzt has reached that level of notoriety already. Anyway, that's the rough plot line, and to do that, to hunt Drizzt down, they, his mother, Matron Malice, remember that name, it's bad, does in fact go and resurrect Zagnafane's body and turns him into a undead monster that she has control of, or thinks she has. And Zagnafane, the ghost, the spirit wraith, runs around and kills just about everybody until at the end he recognizes Drizzt, his personality comes through one final time, and he sacrifices himself, destroys Malice, the House Do'Urden ends, and that's that. Yeah. It's a bit well, I don't want to say pathetic, but it has a lot of pathos, and it's a bit cheesy also. But that's just how this book runs. Let's go through the structure, and then we'll talk about, you know, the other stuff. The structure is the same as the previous one, which means 5 parts, each introduced by a first-person narrative by Drizzt, where he just reflects on stuff and talks about meaningless, you know, motivational poster kind of crap, as always. That's that. The parts are roughly one about Drizzt running around alone in the Underdark. It's called The Hunter, and it talks about him losing his humanity, I guess, and becoming just an animal in the way that all he thinks about is survival, and his personality gets stripped away by that. That's part 1. Part 2 is him hanging out in Blingdenstone. It's weird to pronounce that. In Blingdenstone, which is the underground gnome Swerfnapley city, with his good buddy Belvar Disengulp, whom he got mutilated in the first book. Remember that part? Yeah. So he hangs out with them. Meanwhile, Zagnafane, or the corpse Zagnafane, is coming closer. So Drizzt gets kicked out of Blingdenstone because they're afraid of war, you know, or damage done to the city by that drow monster, which kind of makes sense. So the next part is Drizzt and Belvar, who comes with him as a friend, wandering around in the Underdark together, sort of fleeing well, yeah, not sort of fleeing, but fleeing Zagnafane and just wandering around, making new friends and having adventures. Then part four is them getting, well, getting caught by a bunch of mind flayers and having adventures in Mind Flayer Town, while Zagnafane comes closer. And then part five is just about that final stuff. Zagnafane sacrificing himself, Housestone getting destroyed, and Driz deciding to go to the surface because the gnomes won't have him. And that's kind of how that ends. So the structure works out, I guess. I think part four is too long. From just a structural critique, but we have sort of the same issues, and we'll talk about them in a moment, that we had with the first novel in that regard. We see some attempt at changing that, and we'll see if that is successful or not. So, how does it stack up as a Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms book? Well, it does certainly show a lot more stuff from the Underdark. Well, we have a bit of Menzoberranzan, which is once again a setting that we'll come back to, and it has, its own box set and everything. We get a look at the deep gnome culture, so we see another people that hangs out in the Underdark, and we get a ton of monsters and other creatures that Drizzt usually ends up killing. We have, of course, a basilisk in the prologue, where he kills a basilisk. We have the Mind Flayers as a huge threat, and one of those really, really well-known Dungeons and Dragons monsters finally coming up as monsters. Obviously, one was introduced during the first book, during Homeland, as serving the biggest house in Menzoberranzan. We have other monsters, just showcasing these kind of bits and pieces. So that's, on that regard, I think it works much better than the first book, just by showing more of the Underdark and giving possibilities for stuff that could happen in the Underdark if you, as a dungeon master, plan to let your players try to survive that place. So that's pretty neat in that regard. I'll just leave it there. Are there drawbacks? Well, I mean, obviously the usual stuff still applies, which means the Drow Society is still very much Salvatore's Drow Society and not mainstream Forgotten Realms Drow Society with just following one goddess. That matriarchy, theocracy is still heavily, is still going on. It's still not justified. It still doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We have all of these problems, of course. The idea of having a city, or a city setting in Menzoberranzan where people can join different houses and fight in that whole more like city intrigue. I guess it's sort of someone trying to take ideas of medieval and Renaissance Italy, sort of with feuding noble houses within one city and turning it into a Dungeons and Dragons setting. I think it breaks down immediately because of that whole Loth structure around it. But I can see what it's trying to do. It just doesn't necessarily work. The other problem is, of course, once again, Salvatore's writing abilities are a bit of a problem. See, the idea of Menzoberranzan as a huge cave with castles built into stalactites and stalagmites and so forth, it's a really cool idea. And he goes into some detail describing some of the noble houses, their fortresses or castles or whatever you want to call them, on having several layers and bridges and stuff. This will come back later because obviously these places are described always with a battle map in mind. Because, if players want to run around in these kind of places, they need, obviously, maps, so you can, these things are important in that regard. And there's a bunch of these situations that feel very much like that. The description of Blingdenstone is similar in that regard, with having that first chamber that is just a battle map to fight your way in or out of, or defend. And he spent a lot of time describing that map, and that's maybe something that is new compared to previous books, that he does spend a lot of time in describing the territory in these more tactical ways. Another place is, of course, the acid chamber, where you have a chamber that is, has a lake of acid on the floor and several rock bridges across it, and you have the Corbies attacking and so forth. This feels very much like an encounter you could put one like just like that into your own Dungeons and Dragons campaign, have your players come and try to cross that acid lake. It also seem to be a very, very tough encounter for a group of, well, even 4 or 5 characters, I guess. But it's in there, and there's more of these situations. So obviously the what's it called, the Illithid, the Mind Flayer city or fortress is another of these places. So this book is really heavy on encounters that seem to be plucked right from the pages of an adventure module in that regard. Works well in that they're really cool in that regard. Doesn't work so well because most of these are incredibly overpowered. A city with 150 mind flayers, yeah, no way your players are going to fight their way out of that unless they're already like level 20 or something. Just facts here. So it does once again make the characters way overpowered compared to what feels realistic in a Dungeons and Dragons game back then or now. But then again, this is supposed to be advertisement and not realistic. So that's what we got when it comes to the D&D side of things. Let's talk a bit more of the general structure. See, in last time I talked about the fact that compared to the Icewind Dale trilogy, and up to a point the Legacy, which we'll come to very soon, the problem here is that Drizzt is the only character, basically. And that's very much the case in Homeland, where the only friend he has is sort of Zagnafane, whom he doesn't actually talk to that much, which will come back later, and maybe Guinevere, but Guinevere doesn't actually talk because she's a cat. It's a cat, he's a cat, she's a cat, I guess. I'm assuming her gender now. That's that. Doesn't have conversation, so that kind of falls to the wayside. In this book, he gets friends, and there's some interesting stuff going on there. He gets to hang out with Belvar Disengulb, who is, of course, a Swerve Nebly gnome, and there's some interesting tension between those two, because Belvar is still very much one-dimensional, but it's a less over-the-top kind of thing compared to, say, Brunner or Wolfgar or Regis. There's a bit more nuance here. Maybe that is R.A. Salvatore becoming a better writer, or maybe he just didn't have any good idea of how to make the gnome something more, or like something more outrageous, but it kind of works. There's obviously a lot of inconsistencies with, him having his magical hammer and pickaxe as arm prosthesis at this point, but still doing stuff where I'm like, no, that doesn't work. You can't have even if they're magical, you can't use them to pick up things, very small things, and do all kinds of crap that he does with his magical hand. That doesn't work like that. But then again, it's not exactly a realist novel, is it? So we have that. We then also have, and this is an interesting attempt at doing something that doesn't really fully work, but it's an attempt, and I want to give credit here. They meet Clacker, who was a Petch, which is another Underdark species, and he was turned by an evil wizard. Remember, wizards are all evil and kind of mad and whatnot, into a Hook Horror, which is one of these Underdark monsters that got introduced in book 1 of this series. And he's slowly succumbing to that and losing his mind and becoming just a monster. And you can see how that is, in a way, mirroring the thing that happens to Drizzt in the beginning of this book in part 1, when the Hunter, as his part of personality is called, kind of takes over his personality or erases his personality because, survival is the only thing that he thinks about. He doesn't have contact with other people of his kind or any kind, in fact. And the idea that you need social contact, that, social contact is in fact something that makes us human. As Terry Pratchett calls it, the Brownian motion of society is necessary. I get it. It's a good idea. Obviously, the idea of having a social creature being magically turned into a monster kind of takes that away because it shows the turning into a monster, but it does not, in fact, show how actual contact with other people does help. It does help a little, but it still can't be changed because it's magic. So I guess the metaphor or the allegory that he's trying to set up here with that mirroring gets broken by the need to also showcase the use of the spell polymorph. Polymorph other in that case, of course. And that's a bit of a shame because it could have been good. The idea of having someone being turned into a monster and people still respecting him and so forth is cool. once again, I think it kind of fails either in that regard, either because Salvatore is still not skilled enough as a writer to pull it off fully, or it fails because of the requirement to have that spell in there. I just don't know what the need there was, whether he had to use that form of magic in that regard, or if there's another issue going on there. I don't know. It just kind of breaks the metaphor when there's just magic and they can't change that. Whereas Drizzt gets to change it, because then Drizzt is still our special boy and everyone else falls to the wayside. Which brings us, obviously, to the problem of writing prequels after you've already written another trilogy. Because we know that once he reaches Icewind Dale, all the friends he's going to make during his time in this prequel series will be dead or gone or both. Because in Icewind Dale, his friends are Catti-brie, Brunner, and Wulfgar and Regis. They are no longer Belvar Disengulp or Clacker the Petch or anyone else of that sort, or Zagnafane even. We already know they're gone. And that's a bit of a problem. There's obviously other problems, or not necessarily problems, but stuff that we can see him trying to introduce, right? These inconsistencies. In the Crystal Shard, for example, he talks about, when when Salvatore introduces Guinevere, he talks about that incident with the cave fisher that is sort of near the end of Homeland. He introduces that one. He even mentions the part where Guinevere gets to kill a lot of Swerve Nebly. So we kind of know he has to hit those things that he mentions or name drops or just drops hints at in the later books. He has to kind of incorporate them, or feels he has to incorporate them in this book to make it all, feel like an ongoing story. That's one side of that prequel thing. The other side is, of course, that there's a certain lack of tension. We know Drizzt will survive, because we've read the later books. We know he will survive. And we know he'll survive with his entire body intact, because, he's still very healthy. No eye patches, no nothing in, Crystal Shard. And we know that all his friends will be left behind, which kind of takes a bit away from, that level of friendship or group play that we have sort of evolving here with Belvar and, what's his name, Clacker. Now, the other problem is, of course, the tone, once again. See, because everything is dark and evil down in the Underdark, everything is also very hopeless, and all they can hope for is just to be alone and not actually build a greater society, which is a bit of a shame, because there's some glimpses, right? Salvatore manages to, when he describes the Swerve Nebly society, he manages to show that, yes, actually working together, having interactions, positive interactions, building something together is a good thing. He manages to try to contrast it with Drow society. But the fundamental idea of Dungeons and Dragons, of having one species have basically the same moral and personal makeup than the and another having that different, like that uniformity, kind of takes away from that. Because is it really the choice of the Swerve Nebly to be cool social people, and is it really the choice of the Drow to be evil, or is it something that is written into the fundamental laws of the universe here? And that sort of where that kind of form of world building that has to adhere to rules, written down rules, because at the end of the day, it is a game, right, that needs written down rules, kind of comes up against realism, and also comes up against choices, because Drow deserting the Spider Queen and deciding to become good would fundamentally alter the entire world. And that's nothing that can happen within Dungeons and Dragons, or not happen easily. Also, and this is certainly the problem that Salvatore got himself into, with having all the Drow be evil because they worship just one goddess. That's a choice he made. Yes, they're still sort of chaotic and evil and so forth in general, but they have different gods and goddesses, have a full pantheon in other forms of the Forgotten Realms and other source books, which allows them way more nuance in how they are, maybe self-centered, or maybe all kinds of other forms of, society are possible if you have that level. that level of freedom or that level of variety. But by taking all of that away and turning it all into that Spider Queen thing, Salvatore makes it harder or more difficult for himself to make all of that feel realistic, and then is definitely not the kind of writer that could pull that off. Which obviously brings us back to that part that takes place in Menzoberranzan. And there is a bit of a problem here that I wanted to address quickly. We talked about this being a matriarchy, and there's an interesting thing I noticed over time. Is like at the same time these books were written, Robert Jordan wrote The Wheel of Time, and at the same time Terry Goodkind was writing The Sword of Truth. And all of these books, what they have in common is female characters using violence to assert their dominance. We have the Aes Sedai and all the spanking going on in Wheel of Time. We have the Drow matriarchy and all the Drow women using whips with snakes at the end, using to assert their dominance and, beat men, Drow men in their world. And with Sword of Truth, we have the, I keep forgetting what they are called, that serve the bad guy, the bondage women with the BDSM women with all their tools like whips and stuff to once again dominate men. And I'm just wondering what's going on that all of fantasy suddenly decides to be very kinky at the end of the 80s. There's a bunch of ideas that I have. I'm not sure where they go. One of them is certainly that with feminism and second wave feminism in particular, going through its phases into the 80s, the idea of women in power is suddenly something that men had to reckon with in a different way than, say, in the 50s and 60s, where it was just laughed at. Now, there are definitely powerful women at that point in society. Very few, don't get me wrong. So the image of the power of a woman in power has changed from something to be made fun of into something actually threatening and something actually, dangerous, sort of, for people from a very specific patriarchal viewpoint, right? It's like suddenly you may have a female boss, and now you maybe feel dominant because your boss is exerting, threats over you and exerting power over you, and that's just something that happens in every system, but it sticks out because it's suddenly someone you are not expecting to do that from all your, social background and so forth, and I'm wondering if that's maybe the reason why suddenly we get all these angry, powerful female characters in a fantasy at that point, because fantasy once again allows writers to kind of work through that, and I think it's once again it's a bit of a problem because especially with the Drizzt books, they are sort of targeted at a younger audience. So this image of women in power being evil or being a threat is once again sort of passed off to a group of people who are still forming their image of society in a much more in a way than, say, Sword of Truth, which I guess is aimed at a slightly older audience. With Wheel of Time, I'm not quite sure. The other interesting part is, of course, the sexual component to that. Obviously, the 1980s were, on the one hand, a bit of a complicated time when it comes to sexual freedom and so forth. We are, however, obviously past the sexual revolution, and fantasy authors have slowly discovered that it is okay to write about sex. At least some of them have. Now, there's a level of prudishness in Wheel of Time that I've talked about. There's certainly a level of prudishness in an even higher level of prudishness in this book. In the Drizzt books, once again, because they're basically YA books. There's less of that in the Sword of Truth, as far as I can tell. I've only read the first one there. But, the interesting thing is when you compare it with another book that I think is interesting in this regard, which is Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay, which has very explicit sexuality in it and has very explicit bondage sexuality in it. It kind of goes that extra step. Guy Gavriel Kay uniting the violence and the sexuality. Now, we can argue whether that is good or bad and whether he's successful at it or not, but he does combine those two things, whereas the other three authors that I've just been talking about are very clear about ignoring or at least hushing up or avoiding the sexual component that is very, very heavily implied in the way they describe that female on male violence or the domination that they describe, right? There's whips and there's spanking, and everyone has to, pull down the men's, pants to spank their bottoms in Wheel of Time. But it's very much not sexual. And here you have women constantly whipping men, and it's very much not sexual because sex doesn't happen in these books. It's just interesting to see how maybe looking at these gender dynamics that were definitely that were definitely changing throughout that time, kind of fails in some of these books because they are very specifically leaving out parts of those dynamics in a lot of ways, and and that's just weird in this book. And once again, there's a level of cartoonish evil in this matriarchy, and the women are all evil, maliciously smiling all the time, always looking for a dagger in the back. And there's another ritual scene described here when they sacrifice matron Xenophei and all that. It's so cartoonish. It's interesting that anyone could read that and think this is a in any way meaningful description of evil, and not just cartoonish levels of bad guy violence. And yeah, turning the matriarchy or the female empowerment or the powerful female characters into such cartoonish villains kind of does disempower them again, I guess. And once again, I most of this flew over my head when I read this as a kid, don't get me wrong. And I suspect it flew over most people's heads, but just because you're not actively, questioning these things does not mean it doesn't, leave marks in your personality and your view of people in general. So that's something I find important to look at. The other part is, of course, something that still keeps going on in these books. Every problem is solved by violence. Even with the Swerve Nebulae, they're all really good fighters. And of course, wizards are still stupid and evil. We have this encounter with that one wizard who apparently turned the Petch Clacker into the Hook Horror, throws a fireball at Drizzt and whatnot, Drizzt and Belvar, and has this traveling metal tower that he just drags with him and just pops up somewhere in the place. And, he gets killed. And from all we get, he's once again incredibly stupid. He's once again a failure, and that constant describing knowledge, describing intellectual pursuit, because being a wizard is of course an intellectual pursuit. You read books, you learn spells and whatnot. Constantly disparaging these kind of characters as useless and powerless, and always getting beat up by physical violence. After all, I wonder how much deep-seated trauma is built into that depiction, because it's not necessarily something you find in the Forgotten Realms source books, or not necessarily on, at gaming tables all over the place, where wizards can be powerful in all kinds of ways and good characters. And that's something unique here, for example, when you compare it to, say, Dragonlance, where Raistlin is certainly not the most sympathetic character, but he's certainly not a laughingstock in the way that wizards are constantly the butt of the joke in all of these books. And I found it interesting that even in this book, Salvatore found a way to include a stupid wizard. Yeah, I think that's just important to notice. All right, with all that out of the way, I want to mention that we see even Salvatore coming up with further elements to make his monolithic drow society less monolithic. That is, of course, the introduction of Jalaxley, the possibly most interesting, or one actually interesting drow character so far. And he will remain that because, spoiler, he'll come up later again. Because he's actually an interesting character. So we see there is some nuance in drow society. It is possible if you ignore the stuff you set up earlier, which is, of course, what Salvatore has to do with this book here. Which, I guess better some changes than nothing happening, and that's what we got here. What else is important before we leave this for today? I don't know. I think the book just dragged on too long. As I said, within the structure, the combat within the Mind Flayer castle is just boring. We get like two scenes where Belvar has to fight against another monster, like an ogre and a hook horror in an arena. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. Mind Flayers are evil. Um, it just takes time that is just used to showcase cool Mind Flayers. Does nothing for the plot. Um, and the fact that not even Drizzt actually has to do much in these parts kind of showcases how unnecessary these are from like a story perspective. But I guess they had to be included because Mind Flayers, as I said, are very much key monsters, or one of the specifically Dungeons and Dragons kind of monsters. They may be seen as a more cosmic horror equivalent. I mean, they look like walking Cthulhu's basically, with a squid head with tentacles and using mind powers and so forth. I guess the we had to kind of show the psionics handbook at this point. Yeah, I get why they're in there. I just think it's unnecessary in that regard. So yeah, oh yeah, economy makes no sense. Gnomes love rocks, which is apparently their one defining feature. So they go and take gold and obviously take all the gems out of the earth for something. It's interesting that there are depictions of people paying for stuff, but it's never made clear how that works. Are there gnome farmers? I don't know. We don't see them. Do they actually need to pay, buy stuff from each other? Is there a functioning capitalist economy? We don't know. It doesn't make any sense. People just take gold because gold is shiny, um, which is an interesting take, especially when you compare it to later books or earlier books when people, run around on the surface in a society that feels much more like our society, and we just assume that there is a functioning capitalist economy somewhere going on. So you have to pay for your beer in a bar and stuff like that. Is that happening in the underdog? We don't know. Are there even drow bars in the in Menzoberranzan? I don't know, because we've only seen people sitting in their chapels and being mean to each other, which, yeah, I guess. So once again, choosing what to show and what not to show is an important aspect of these books, and they're leaving a lot out in. He's leaving a lot out. Salvatore's leaving a lot out in this book, and chooses to just show cool monsters that get killed by Drizzt instead, which, yeah, I guess that will remain something going forward. Anyway, Drizzt is finally on the surface, and we already know he needs to become a ranger and not just a fighter. He needs to meet his mentor, and he needs to find a goddess. Will all of that happen in Sojourn? Well, I guess we'll all have to stay tuned to find out. And until then, thanks for watching. I'll see you very soon. Cheers.